and build it in ways that people have no clue you are the architectural genius behind them. So all that as a preview for our time together today. So on the podcast, what I normally do, we model our rhythms for people. So we just check in together and then we listen a little bit. I don't have an agenda for the conversation. We listen to Jesus and ask him to bring the agenda. And then I follow the threads with radical observation, basically, and curiosity. Does that sound good for you today?
Sounds wonderful.
All right, great. So we'll take 30 seconds to take a deep breath and check in with ourselves. And then we'll just check in with each other. We do this so often. So it's natural for you and I to do this. So I'll take a minute to breathe. I've been going all morning. All right. You want to go first?
Sure. Well, I'll just go with one that's very fresh on my mind. I just left a meeting with two of our dear friends in the local community I'm a part of, the Eden community here, and we were doing similar kinds of things, listening to the Lord together, but also planning for our big foundations workshop that starts here in a couple of days here in Abilene. And so it's just such a joy to work with people who share a common sense of call with the Lord and who are awake to what God's up to in their lives at this moment, and to be planning for the chance to share with people from a lot of places some of the things God's been giving to us, as well as anticipating lots of learning that we'll do from the people that are coming from all parts of the U.S. So just came out of that meeting feeling, really energized and hopeful. I'm a teacher at heart and a builder at heart. And so the chance to create something new with dear friends and collaboration gives me lots of joy and kicks off a lot of the sparks of energy in my soul. So I'm coming to you happy and excited today.
Thank you. You dropped a lot in that check-in that we will unpack, I'm sure, in our conversation, just for people tuning in. Eden Center, regenerative workshops, lots of things. They have no clue what these are, but hopefully by the end of our call, they will have an idea of what these things are. So thank you for that. I am checking in as excited, thankful, relieved, and super satisfied. So I'm excited to be live with you, to have this interview finally. We've talked about doing this for months and I've been like pushing it off and waiting. And so I'm like, it's here. So I'm super excited about that. My daughter just finished her 8th grade graduation. And I got sent the pictures and all of that. And I'm taking her out today to celebrate. We'll have a big party for her. So super excited for that milestone in her life. Had a really beautiful call with our facilitators just now. So deeply satisfied. It really is a privilege like none other to walk with the people that God gathers around us to be able to learn from. So really satisfied with that. I think I'm in. All right. Why don't we listen? When the podcast is released, I'll shorten it so people don't have silence on the podcast. But for the live, they'll just have to wait with us and listen. Maybe if you're live listening to us, you can listen too and listen around. What questions do I have for Dr. Kent Smith? Do I have any questions or anything I want to hear him talk about? And maybe you don't know him enough to have any questions, but maybe you have questions for Luke 10. And if you're in the chat, I am not in the chat right now, so I might not be able to answer your questions immediately, but we will have a debrief session at some point where we just unpack any questions that have been sent to us and talk about them. So please, if you're there and you have questions from the last session, feel free to put them in there. Again, this is lk10.com/live where we're having the chat. You can chat on Instagram and Facebook. I'm not there either. So if you're chatting there, I trust that maybe one of our community members will be there and they'll jump in and answer some questions you might have for us. All right. So Ken, do you think 2 minutes is good?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. And we're just going to be listening about Jesus. What do you want us to talk about today? What's the most important thing for us to cover in our time together. And Kent, what I've been asking other people in this series is, what is your unique contribution? If you had to, I mean, I'm going to tell you what I think your contribution is, but I want you to think, God, what is my unique contribution? And share some of that. And then I've been asking people as well, what if they not had a chance to share yet, that maybe is just burning in their heart that they want to say? So that might be something too that you might want to listen on. Okay.
Sounds great.
All right. I'll be back in 2.
See you then.
Right, whenever you're ready. Beautiful. Well, I'll share first. I heard because I'm so familiar with you, I didn't really introduce you yet. On the podcast, I'll do a little intro for that, but I didn't introduce you today. And I was like, wow, I didn't introduce him yet. So I wanted to do a little bit of that. And then, my biggest curiosity is divine governance and sociocracy. And I want the history on that with you. So that's where my heart is. But anything that you heard while you were listening?
Sure. Well, we can we can unpack this as we go. But
Okay.
I think, one thing that is very central for me is just us all rediscovering, reclaiming the core idea, the core truth that God is love, and that the invitation of God all along has been an invitation to love as a lifestyle. I'm kind of a systems thinking kind of a guy, and so I have to work that out in the nuts and bolts of what does it look like to live love as a lifestyle. And my conclusion after lots of years of working on this is it involves every dimension of our life, every single thing that we do, every relationship that we have is meant to be profoundly shaped by the truth that God is love. And so if we take it out to the 80,000 foot level, that's probably one of the things that's a passion of mine that has made its way into Luke 10 over the years.
All right, we will unpack that then. Let me introduce you for those who don't know who you are. It's going to be, a very probably short introduction, but you are a professor at Abilene Christian University, and is it true that you've been doing that for 30 years, Kent? Just,
Started in 91, so I guess we're at 32 now.
that's incredible. In the same place, in the same city, for someone like me who's lived all over and moved around quite a bit. That's an incredible track record. You're an author, of course, with John and I, and of books of your own and articles of your own, and co-founder of Luke 10, and co-founder of the Eden Center for Regenerative Culture.
Yeah.
Co-founder. Okay. Co-founder of the Eden Center for Regenerative Culture. And I'm going to let you unpack for us a little bit. We know what Luke 10 is, kind of. John was on the podcast earlier, and people who are showing up live today hopefully have a little idea of who Luke 10 is. But this idea, this Eden Center for Regenerative Culture, is probably new to most of our listeners. So give us a brief on what that is.
Sure. Well, to tell a long story as short as I can, about 10 years into our work at ACU, Karen and I had a chance to spend a year in England. We were looking at life and the post-Christendom world in Europe at that time. This is 2002. And coming away from that time, we felt like we needed to really raise the bar on the level of training that we were offering our grad students in seminaries to live this life. So back to love as a lifestyle. Lots of good book learning, lots of good things happening at sort of the academic level in our seminary. But the dean and I agreed that we needed a much more practical, hands-on, life-on-life experience of building community with one another, coming to pay better attention to the world around us and how we can join God and what God's doing there. So we launched what was called the Missionary Residency for North America. Ran that for 10 years or so, and 70 plus graduate students went through that process. And at the end of it, Karen and I, my wife and I, looked at each other and said, "This has been wonderful. It's been powerful, but there's three big things that we're realizing are not being well addressed by what we've done so far." The first was we realized that our students were coming to us more and more broken. And, if you're trying to build community, deep, intimate, powerful, God-attending community with people who are profoundly broken, you got challenges because trust is a huge issue. And we were trying to do this in 18 months to 2 years. And a lot of times people were just getting, by the end of that time, to where they were willing to lean into community at deeper levels. So that brokenness was an issue that we realized we were going to have to address. A lot of our students didn't have any imagination for what it would be like to live in an intergenerational community where people are living interdependently with people of other ages than their own. Most of our students had been with people of peer age from preschool on through graduate school, mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s. And their whole imagination for life going forward is hanging out with people my age, whether they move to Chicago or Singapore. And we realized that's not a sustainable model. That wow. Is, people land on the ground in one of those cities and they're buried in trying to just survive in life. And if their only way of building communities with people their own age, their only imagination is for that, that's going to be super problematic over time. And the third thing was we just realized that they didn't really have any deep experience or imagination for living a covenant life together, living in a committed relationship with other people. The job came along, desire for better weather, all kinds of things would motivate people to pack up and leave the community they've been forming. And in America, that's kind of the normal modus operandi, but it's not very good for building.
Right. And covenant life together used to be called family, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. 150 years ago.
Right? Yeah.
It
That
was
took
built
to
in.
run with. Yeah. And then it just disintegrated, and with it, so did the concept of having a people that you travel through life with
Yes.
for
Yeah.
the long haul. Beautiful. When you say, I just want to break down when you say, raise the bar on training so people can learn to love. Like you were noticing, you're training people in seminary, in college and seminary, and you're recognizing they're getting Bible and they're getting all kinds of intellectual knowledge, but they're not learning to love. And as I would phrase that for myself, I would say, you mean they're not able to have a healthy relationship? Is that what you're saying? They don't know how to bond with people healthily. They don't know how to have conflict with people healthily. Maybe
Yes.
they don't even know how to appreciate their own contribution. So just trying to break that learning to love out for people. How else would you describe that?
I think that's perfect. And your point about extended family being gone, I
Mm,
think we can trace a lot of the ills that I've been describing back to the fact that people are not growing up in extended families like they have for most of human history in most of the world, right? Places where aunts and uncles, grandparents, children, babies, nephews, and nieces are all around us, and we're growing up moving through life in a cohort of folks who know us well, who love us
mm,
imperfectly, no doubt, much of the time, but still there's a place where we're known. And
mm,
we're about 100 years away from that experience in the Western world, especially in North America. And so most people don't even have a memory of family like that, of that kind of
mm.
place where you're seen, known, celebrated, drawn out.
Yeah.
Again, it's never been perfect, but it's always been normative that sort of structure was a part of human life, whether it was the first century ecosystems of the oikos households, whether it was colonia and in the cities of Latin America, whether it was tribal groups in North America or Africa. I mean, every part of the world, people have normally lived in a walkable context where they were seen and heard and known most of their life. And we're 100 years into an experiment where that's not true. Our students are definitely uh, demonstrating the
Mm,
outcome of that loss of core community. So we've been using the language of attachment a lot in Luke 10.
mm,
But if you don't know how to attach to another person, you don't know how to be deeply attached to yourself, um, you've missed the training ground for being deeply attached to God, because that's precisely where God intended us to learn to be loved and to know
wow.
how to love.
So you're noticing this, that your students are lacking this sticky kind of love, basically,
Yep.
that's essential for kingdom living.
Yes.
And yet you're supposed to be training them in how to live this way, but you're realizing there's a disconnect here because we're giving them all this intellectual knowledge, but that's not helping them actually develop the skills necessary to love well. So what happens?
So this is a long way to get around to answering your first question, which is
Okay.
about 12 years into running this graduate program, we realized, some of the core things that are still not being addressed, as good as it's been, what we've done so far, really can only be dealt with by providing a demonstration community. People need a chance to see this working. They need a chance to see intergenerational, interdependent communities of God's love in practice, in order to catch the vision for it and begin to decide, I could live differently than I've been handed as the options as a normal person in North America.
So you're saying that they would have to see it modeled before they could even imagine how that could look in their own lives, in their own cities, and their own families.
Yeah, and again, it's a really strange product of our time that we have to design this. It was normal for most of human history and most of the world, but it's not now, and we have to be very, very intentional about it if we're going to have it. Yeah. So that is the genesis of the Eden community. Karen and I issued an invitation to some close friends. Two couples joined us to start with, and we began, and then we've had several other couples join us. And our purpose here is really just to be an incubator community, to create a community that intergenerational. We've got folks that are close to 70 and folks that are 7 months old, and lots of ages in between. And this is a context where students can come alongside. They can join us in the parts of our life that make sense for them to join us. They can see it. They can ask questions. They can push back. And so that is the genesis of the Eden community. We think of ourselves as a specially called group. Every group is specially called. Our calling is to be a demonstration site for what this kind of life can look like. Invite others alongside, learn from them, but also contribute to them, hopefully, a vision and some evidence that this way of life is still possible in the 21st century.
Wow. So a demonstration site of multi-generational community learning to love and live in the love of God and the life of God itself. Wow. So you're having a retreat this week. Tell us just a little bit about that, and then I'll get into your other unique contributions to this relational revolution that are all synergistic. But what's this week? What is your retreat you're doing?
So, lots of people can't break away for a year to come in and do what's now called our Eden Fellows program, and do an 18-hour graduate certificate in this regenerative culture. But we know everybody needs it, or everybody that wants to should have access to it. So we started last year, had our first Foundations for Regenerative Culture workshop. Had some people from around the country and Canada, and are looking forward to the second of those 5-day, 4-night gatherings, where we'll take a deep dive into 10 elements of how to live into your story, your settings, and your systems.
Wow. So that's happening, and that you're thinking that's an annual retreat that you will be offering there in Texas, on the ground, so people can see what this community could look like, because you're all there, right? But also learn the elements that make up the structure of that, like we were talking about at the beginning, the pipes and the walls that people don't really see, but that are the very foundation of a community like this. Like a strong building's foundation would be so important to know how to lay one of those. Is that kind of what this does then? It gives you the tools to lay a good foundation for a community.
Yes, of course, the master architect of all community is the source of love, God's own self, and God's always inviting us into this kind of amazing community with particular people in a particular place at a particular time around specific needs and strengths that community has. So what we're not teaching people is a franchisable model. That's not how God works, right? Just stroll across a meadow sometime. You're not going to see exact duplicates of anything, but God loves unity and diversity. And so
you're not giving people a model so
right.
much as you're giving them a process to connect with God and each other and follow where God leads them as a community. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yep. A way of paying attention to what God is up to in the world. We could become radical attention payers like Jesus was. I do nothing of my own initiative. Jesus said, I only do what I see and hear the Father doing. And so that's a way of life that Jesus has always invited his followers into. Follow me is not a one-time event. It's a way of life. And if we invite people into that kind of radical attention paying, we'll always be a part of this amazing ecosystem of God's inbreaking kingdom where we are, that is absolutely unique to that place, that time, and that people.
Wow, that's beautiful. And Kent, you and I hold a tension. We were talking in the last session about the tensions Luke 10 holds. And some of those tensions, just for fun, for people who weren't in that session: viral yet sustainable, disciple making yet evangelistic, micro yet global, high tech yet high touch, spontaneous yet structured, spirit led yet skill based, united yet diverse, pastoral yet missional, faith-based yet science-based. And you and I have held a unique tension with each other this whole our 10 years together, because Matt and I found an intentional community training center in Uruguay before we were ripped away from it. And I've been planted back in Nashville now, where my extended family is within 45 minutes, all of them within 45 minutes, where there's about 30 of us when we're all together. And so I long for my biological family to live this intentional community that you are doing apart from your biological family, right? Because like I have mine now. Like when I was in Uruguay, I was doing what you were doing because I didn't have my family. I'm like, I have my family. But it's a lot more complicated to try to do this with your biological family, because a lot of them don't want to be intentional with you, and they don't want to be intentional about any of this stuff. So I just laugh because as you're talking, I'm still like, okay, which couples could I get to this retreat with you? Is there anyone in my family that I could kidnap and bring down to Texas so we could even think about this from a biological family system point of view? But maybe it will come.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think about Jesus and his own dilemma around all that, right? One day he says, when he's told, hey, your mother and brothers are here, he says, well, my mother and brothers are those who are hearing God's word and enacting it. And so in Jesus' own life, at least for a while, there were big chunks of his family that were not all in, right? It took some time. Later on, we know that James was a key part of the early disciple leadership. We know that his mother obviously was a key person, but Jesus wasn't limiting his family because he understood that ultimately the family of God is comprised of those who are ready to receive from God the love that God wants to give. And so, we work with who we can, and hopefully that includes our biological family to one degree or another. But yeah, it's that is I think something that all of us live with to one degree or another.
So complex. Okay, so can we get to the question at hand for me?
Sure.
And you might have a different answer, so I'll ask you first. If you had to say what your unique contribution to the revolution is, I mean, there's many, but your unique contribution, what would you say it is?
Well, I mean, I think at the biggest level, we're going to get to what I think is what you want us to talk about, which is great. At the biggest level, I think it's the sort of unrelenting passion I have to remember that the story we're in is one that begins in God's life of joy, ends in deeper joy, and is an invitation for all of us to enter into that amazing life of God that is the invitation to come and share in our delight. I think that meta story, the story that underpins all stories, is such a theological foundation for everything that's important in history, everything that's important in Luke 10. And I can't stop talking about that because it's pretty foundational. But I think it does point to some of the more specific tools or areas of focus that I brought to Luke 10. And so we can jump into divine governance if you like to, because I think that's clearly a key area that I have a passion for, and that ultimately I think shapes a whole lot of what we do.
Definitely. So I will say, yes, I've encountered your passion around this, because apparently you want it in every single book we write. John and I are like, Kent, we said that in the last book, and you're like, yeah, we did, and we're saying it in this one too. So that has been fun to watch, this unrelenting, as you say, passion that this begins in joy, ends in joy, and it's an invitation to come. And it is, I love the way you always come back to it. Even earlier today, you've already come back to it once, just to remind us that in fact, what did you say? You said God's own self is the foundation. As you're talking about the foundation of community and healthy, you're like, well, it's God's own self. Like we're being invited into him. And as we're deeper into him, he differentiates each one of us with our unique designs. He connects us together. He tells us how to move in the world. He connects us to the world around us. I mean, it really is a vision that I think has to be said over and over and over again, because it's so foreign to my training, even as a missionary and as a community constructor myself. It's so radically different. So I really appreciate the unrelenting passion that the original family existed before the foundations of the earth, and it's still with us. This family to model and invite into the joy of community. Very different theology from a lot of other theologies out there. And it seems like it's that original family for you that probably pushed you out of church governance, out of normal church governance. So I want to hear the story of how you found sociocracy and divine governance, what that looked like for you. And was that the impetus that pushed you out of kind of going, Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit don't function like any church I've seen? So talk to me about that.
Yeah. Well, as we were planning to launch the Eden Center and the Eden community, I was looking at a lot of my own experience in mission team development and formation, a lot of the challenges that we've seen on mission context, whether in North America or anywhere else in the world. So many teams that blow up over time for one reason or another, but often the ability to decide together, to steer together, was coming up for me as a key issue that we had to address. So I was doing some research around all of that. A friend of mine, I'd asked a guy in 92, I think, just a year or so after I started here, who is kind of a famous missionary trainer in our tribe. You know, what have you learned in all these years of training teams, sending them all over North America and around the world? And it may have just been a bad day for him. He may have just gotten news from some team breakup, but he said, Kent, the first thing I've learned is that North Americans don't know the first thing about community. And I thought at the time, what a weird response. Here's a guy who spent decades, 40 or 50 years at that point, training missionaries. And his response to what have you learned is Americans don't know how to do this, don't know how to do this community thing. But as I have trained now over 30 years. And
I'm going to tell you, I was on mission teams with people from all over the world, and none of them know how. It's not just Americans.
Not just Americans, right? I mean, it's part of the human condition, right? I mean, people don't get along well together, period. Haven't ever. Ultimately, there's, without divine involvement, we all fall into our worst selves, not our best selves. But this was feeling existential for me as we were getting ready to form a team and a community that's supposed to be a prototype community or an incubator community. Yeah. How are we going to not do the same stupid things that so many that we've witnessed have done? And so I was doing research and looking at communities of various kinds down through history and some of the contemporary groups. And I got onto several places where people were saying, well, we started out doing decision by consensus. And that didn't work very well for very long because there was always somebody who would block a decision. I don't agree. And it didn't matter how much they knew about the topic, how much they cared about the topic. They could just be a broken person who didn't agree with anything from anybody, and they could shut the whole group down. And so we were losing people and talent and all kinds of things because of that. So we moved to Robert's Rules of Order. Let's move to a good democratic majority rules. And when we did that, we started getting some things done, but we also found ourselves in war camps because everybody's always trying to get in a more majority, and the minority is always feeling disenfranchised. And so you don't have to look very far in North American politics to see how that plays out over time. Everybody's finding the thing that the other people are flawed at, throwing sand in the machine as much as possible while they're in power, so you can get in power and be on the receiving end of the sand from the other group. And so several groups said, and so what we did after we tried that majority rule democratic approaches was we would go to, you're a good person, you're a good leader, you seem to be compassionate. seem to be smart. You make the decisions and we'll go with you. You be our leader. So
The king.
some form of autocracy, right? And that worked great right up until it didn't, right? Right up until it turned out that the one person didn't have enough vision to address the full needs of the context and the people there. And then you have mutinies, or you have explosions of communities and all kinds of things like that. And then we discovered dynamic governance, or sociocracy. And we actually started getting things done. We found ourselves working collaboratively as opposed to oppositionally. And this has worked. So I read about 3 or 4 comments like that from various sources and thought there must be something here. So I did a little research and found out that the key guy in the English speaking world at that point promoting this is a guy named John Buck. And John had gone to Europe and had discovered sociocracy there in Holland. A fellow named Gerard Endenberg had begun this process. And so John went, taught himself Dutch, and learned about sociocracy.
As you do. Sorry.
Right, of course. Why wouldn't you do that, right? Came back to America and then began to promote sociocracy in North America. And soon there were a whole cadre of folks who were.
Do you know what year this was, roughly?
I would get it wrong if I guessed, but when I was chatting with John, he and Sharon Valines had already produced their book on the topic, We the People. And so John was already well into the, getting this out in the English speaking world. So I contacted him and said, hey, John, gave him a little bit of a sense of what we're up to and said, what's the best way for me to get up to speed as fast as possible on what you guys are doing with this? And he said, well, this coming weekend, I'm going to be conducting a workshop on sociocracy in West Haven, Connecticut. A couple other key leaders, Jerry Gonzalez, Koch Gonzalez, and several others are going to be, Diana Leaf Christian are going to be leading. If you'll fly to DC, I'll ride the train up with you to West Haven. We can talk about your questions on the way up. You can do the workshop, and then we can debrief on the way back. So I thought, well, I've spent more than that on a single graduate course. That's worth the investment. So I flew out and had a wonderful 4 or 5 days with John and a number of the key leaders in sociocratic training at that point.
What year? When was that?
This is 2013, maybe 2012.
Okay. I just want people to get a sense of the relative, like, that's recent. I mean, it's not like
10 years ago.
The 80s. I mean, this was very recent that all of this even hit the United States, it seems like. And so, like, it literally just hadn't been around, very long for people to experiment and discover it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when you went to talk with him, I have to ask, had he had too many Christians asking him about the adaptation of this for church governance?
Not many. Yeah, I was among the first, coming from a more faith-based orientation. John and Gerard Endenberg before him were both Quaker by background. And of course, the Quakers have a rich tradition of deep attention paying to the spirit among us. So I said, Endenberg, that's not quite right. Endenberg attended a Quaker school that was launched by Kees Boeke, a Dutch Quaker leader who has impacted lots and lots of important things over the years. He married one of the daughters of the Hershey Empire, and so he had some financial means to work with. But he was a key person. They started a Quaker school in Holland that became one of the most renowned schools in Europe. Lots of royalty from various European nations went to school there. Gerard Endenberg attended there as a young man. And so this is a Quaker school, and they're creating this radically attention-paying culture among the students and the teachers. And Hindenburg said, I wonder if that could be applied in other contexts. And because of his family situation, he ultimately began to, with a graduate degree in cybernetics, which is basically how you govern, he began to use those principles in the business context, and that's when things really began to take off in Europe.
Wow.
So he's the guy that John Buck learned from directly.
Wow. So they're in the States trying to introduce this to the United States. They write We the People, which I just have to put a little plug in for our leader team lesson for this coming month in June, because for all of those in Communities of Practice with Luke 10, we do leader team lessons each month. This month is John White's Cliff Notes. So the John White notes on We the People, and we talk all about divine governance in this leader lesson for our leader teams, our communities of practice. So enjoy that whole lesson, and this is a great intro to that, the history of that. So there you are, having a conversation with him about governance. You're thinking of application in the kingdom of God and in Christ's communities, and what happens next.
Well, John and I really enjoyed our this is John Buck now, our friendship. And so we collaborated about a year later to teach the first graduate course in English on sociocracy and dynamic governance in North America, here at Abilene Christian University in the Graduate School of Theology where I teach. So John and I co-taught that course, and lots of people were profoundly encouraged by that. It was could see all kinds of applications for not only faith-based organizations and nonprofits, but for churches themselves. You know, why wouldn't we want to learn how to pay deep attention to all of the people in an organism or in an organization who have something to contribute to it? And that sounds kind of gospel, doesn't it? To assume that each person brings their own gift, their own wisdom, their own perception of reality that's unique to them. And however you do things, if that voice is just silenced or left to the side, how much poorer the organism is than if it were open to receiving from that rich collection of people that make it up.
So what year was that again, that course?
Probably, I'm going to say 2013 or 14, somewhere in there.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not even 10 years ago, is it? No, it's not even 10 years ago.
Just about a decade ago. Yeah.
This is so fresh. So just to put this into practical, because I know we're not going to go into sociocracy and all of the ins and outs of it on this call, but if you had to say in Luke 10, the things that have been the sociocratic ideas that have kind of penetrated our practices, name some of those for people who are just practicing Luke 10 but have no idea what the construction is behind it.
Yeah. Well, so decision making in groups, decision making in general, has some interesting roots in, of course, across human history. In all times and all places, people have had to organize themselves around ways of making decisions. Some of the ones that I listed: consensus, democracy of various forms, autocracy. All of those have always been around in one form or another, but to deliberately pay attention to how can we steer together is something that is uniquely godlike, and it's uniquely part, I think, of our heritage and our calling as the people of God, as Christians, those who follow God. So, you know, when you get into the weeds of how do you do that, there's some very, very simple principles. Governance, the word governance and the word cybernetics both have their root in the Greek word kubernetes, which means rudder. It's the way by which a ship or a boat sails, right? Steers. So it's all about steerage. And steerage is a simple process of planning, enacting the plan, and then measuring how you're doing on your plan, right? and then adapting by planning again, and then enacting the new plan and measuring again, right? It's that iterative process. That's how we steer bicycles. That's how we steer airplanes from point A to point B. That's how all decision, all governance, all steering happens, is planning, enacting, and measuring. And so, but for Americans in particular, but people in general, it becomes problematic when there's more than one voice involved, right? And so how can we do that kind of steerage where we include, yes, the voices of other people, but even more importantly, the voice of God? Jesus makes it clear that his expectation is that he will lead us, he will guide us by his Spirit, if we're willing to be led, right? If we're not quenching the Spirit, if we're not hardening our hearts against the Spirit, if we're not ignoring the Spirit, then we will be led by God. And that's the invitation of Jesus from the outset, is I'm Lord, and I am inviting you to follow me. And so, as John says in the little article, the move from dynamic governance or sociocracy to divine governance is really simply to include at the center of it the voice of God. And
which I just have to say, I was on many mission teams before finding you guys, and I remember being young and telling Matt, like in my 20s, and telling Matt, I wish I could work on a team, a pastoral team or a mission team with people that knew how to hear God's voice together. Like, I would tell him that in my 20s, because every team I was a part of had a visionary, had somebody kind of, inspiring and leading the way. Yeah. We all prayed individually. We all prayed using words together, but none of us knew how to hear God's voice together or discern him together or listen. Yeah. And if we heard different things independently from God while we were listening and came together, we didn't even know how to resolve that. It was like, I'm hearing this, you're hearing this. What do we do? Well, we just leave, right? We just divide or something, because there was no way to listen to each other's hearts and God's heart together and steer together. So when I found you and John, I was like, this is the bird I've been looking for my whole life. This is it. How are y'all doing this? So it really is incredible. And all of our staff will tell you that. Just anyone on staff will say, this is the most unique experience I've ever had. And they're ruined for life. No, we'll never, if we run dry of money and we all have to go work for someone else, it's not going to happen, because we're going to be ruined. We won't be able to work in a different governing system. But can you tell us just a little bit about how that works? How do we listen to God together and each other's heart and make decisions together?
Yeah. Well, so let me comment on something else you said first, and then I'll come back to that. So I think there are at least two major reasons why we don't live this way. One is that we don't think that God works that way. So especially folks who are from more conservative Christian traditions, but I think largely across the board, we have consigned God to the edges of history and of reality. We don't expect to hear from God. We think prayer is a one-way street. We tell God what we need. We hope God will get around to answering us. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But we're functional deists, as we say in our little book. We're acting as though God is not here. And this is a master plot, I think, by the enemy to draw all of Western culture and certainly Christian culture away from the conviction that Jesus is here. Emmanuel, God is with us, and God is always with us in all contexts. He's right in the middle of this conversation right now, and the people who are listening to it. He's right here, right now. We don't have to guess, what would Jesus do? That very question, that way of thinking, is the most profound evidence that we are functioning as deists. We don't have to ask, what would Jesus do? The question is, Lord, what are you up to? And what would you like for me to know about that right now? That's how we began this call, right? That's because we assume from the get-go, Jesus is here, the Spirit's available to lead us. God is passionately involved in human history. He tenderly loves his whole creation. And we can get in on that if we are willing to listen. It's not by accident that Jesus says more than anything else, if you've got ears to hear, pay attention.
Mm, mm,
You have eyes to see, notice. That's the great need. It's not that God's not active, it's that we aren't paying attention.
wow. So that's the first one, is people think God doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And the second flows out of it, which is we don't normally practice paying attention to God. We haven't seen it done. Like you were saying, as a missionary, it was certainly true for me. I went through seminary. I don't think I ever had a class where the professor stopped and said, we've covered a lot of really important material here. Let's pause now and see what the Lord wants to impress on our hearts about what this means for us today, here and now. That just didn't happen. Again, functional deist. I raise my hand. I am a recovering functional deist, and I still struggle all the time with the habits formed over a lifetime of assuming God is not here. And I've got to figure it out. I've got to make the best judgments I can based on the best information I can find to draw a conclusion about what to do in every situation, because God's not here. That's my challenge. I think it's the challenge of most of the people I've known and worked with over a lifetime in Christian service. And so to rediscover a way of life that places the present active engagement of Emmanuel, God who is with us, in the middle of our practice it's a tall order. I'm still very much, I feel like I'm on training wheels, learning to not be a functional deist in the way I live.
So this is where I kind of get the practical pieces of sociocracy that actually help create these environments. Because the practices, right? Like we check in, which even in secular sociocracy, they check in, right? It might not look the same, might not be as heart to heart connected as ours. I'll admit I've been on some of their calls, but we have rounds, and that's huge. And people experienced that in the last call, if they watched, how every single 20 people on a call had a voice, so we structure it in these rounds. So there is some structure, right? But it doesn't mean there's not spontaneity. It doesn't mean it's squelched, but there is enough structure to assure that we connect heart to heart with each other, and that we listen to God together, and that we practice that listening. And it's just incredible. Those two rhythms alone that we do all the way from a church of two, and the same two rhythms too. That's the amazing thing for me, is whether we have two people or whether we have 500 people leading a community, the rhythms are the same. The way you structure to some degree is very similar. You don't have to learn a whole new set of governing tools,
right?
Which is so new to me as well, because in my life, where pastoral care and mission were completely separate, there was a whole separate set of tools for everything, and none of them were really applied in your family. How did you lead that well? So I have discovered that what you're bringing is that radical too, because it's that simple.
Yeah.
What else would you like to say about that? Any of that?
Well, so I think the circle structure, which is foundational to sociocracy, and I think to the divine life, where every part is seeing one another, every part has an equal has a legitimate voice to offer.
Wow,
that's foundational, because we're saying we don't only hear from God as our individual attention paying grows to God, we're also learning to hear from God by discerning the body of Christ that is here in the room with us. And so we are learning from God as we listen to one another deeply. So again, the idea of being in a circle, and the idea of polling that circle for what's going on for each person, is so critically important if we want to hear from God. The earliest Christians, I love the passage in Colossians that I think takes this to the highest level, and says to a little group, probably definitely meeting in a home somewhere, or in some hidden place, Paul, I assume Paul wrote Colossians, and he says, in Christ, the fullness of deity is presently living in bodily form.
Mm.
So, okay, wait a minute. Jesus has already died. He's already been resurrected. We're decades after the resurrection here. Paul's talking to this little band of folks meeting in a living room somewhere, and he's saying, in Christ, the fullness of God is presently living in bodily form. And you, Colossians, together among yourselves, have the fullness of Christ.
Mm.
See, that's a vision that God is alive in this community. And if we took that seriously, if we realize when I look into your eyes, I'm looking into the eyes of Jesus.
Radical.
It revolutionizes what it means to be attentive to God in some profound ways. And it changes the way we try to form decisions. We know how to poll everyone to kind of think about, well, what's important about this decision, and what could we do, and what will we do, and Lord, what do you want us to do in light of the things that we've been raising and hearing from each other?
It's
so
like every voice begins to matter, because the only way I can see the image of God is to hear their voice.
Exactly.
That is so radically different than the way most of us were raised in church, especially. So radically different.
The whole idea that God just downloads all of God's truth into one smart or visionary or super spiritual person,
or through his word only, in my quiet time by myself. I mean, you can't get the multifaceted wisdom of God by yourself with a written book. You have to get it through living community with people who represent God's unique designs, right? Or his unique design in different ways.
Preach it,
we
sister.
could go on and on this topic. Thank you so much for being with us today, and for the contribution you've made, for just pressing in, for your research, for your hard research that led to something that I believe is the hope of the church today. It's the hope of Christian community and culture if we're ever going to survive or become the bride of Christ. This is the missing piece. And it's so hard to see, because it's like the foundation of something, or like the plumbing in the walls, but crucial if we're gonna function well. So thank you for following God's heart in you and your unique design, and digging in and doing hard work to do this cultural shift. So I appreciate you so much, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Tony. Just one last thought here. God's always been, as we mentioned in the book, Relational Revolution, God has always been drawing the bride back to this amazing vision. And it's not new, it's just forgotten, and it gets forgotten periodically throughout church history for thousands of years now. But it is exciting to be in this moment in time where God is reminding us, is drawing us back to this amazing possibility that we could live spirit-led, Jesus-empowered, joy-fueled lives in our time. And I'm just delighted to get to be a part of it, to have a bit part in a grand pageant that's unfolding here.
I wouldn't want to be anywhere else, with anyone else in time than right now. So thank you for that. I think Hillary is going to be initiating another interview right on the heels of this. So I will log off with you and let them launch whatever they're up to. I'm not sure it might be Colleen. I'm not sure who she's going live with next. But for those of you joining us live, there will be other interviews happening today. And thank you, Dr. Kent Smith.
My joy.
Take care.
Bye for now.
Bye.